On the morning of January 19, 2025, mountain rescue teams climbed toward the upper ridge of Grossglockner in the gray, still air that follows a storm. They were not looking for a survivor. They already knew what they were going to find. They found her approximately 50 meters below the summit cross, not at the bottom of the mountain, not lost in a valley, 50 meters below the top. That is roughly the distance from one end of a tennis court to the other, that close to the finish. That short of everything she came there for. She had been left on the exposed ridge sometime in the early hours of the morning, unprotected, uninsulated, without an emergency blanket, without shelter, while the wind pressed the temperature to somewhere near -20°C. She had been there for hours. Her name was Kerstin Gurtner. She was 33 years old. She was from Salzburg. She had described herself in her own words as a winter child, a mountain person. Someone who felt genuinely at home in snow and altitude when most people feel only cold. Her social media was what it looked like when a love of the outdoors is real rather than performed. Alpine photos, winter mornings, mountain landscapes taken not for followers but because she found them beautiful. She was not a professional climber. She was not trying to build a brand around the peaks. She simply loved them. And she went up Grossglockner that night with the man she trusted most. Her boyfriend, an experienced mountaineer, a man who had spent years on routes that most people never attempt, a man who planned the tour, chose the line, and made every call that mattered before the first step. She did not choose the route. She did not choose the date. She did not choose the footwear. She did not say, "This is the right day, this is the line we should take, we have enough margin to make it." She went because she trusted the person who said all of those things. She died 50 meters from the summit. He walked down. What came next, the investigation, the digital reconstruction, the courtroom, the verdict, would take more than a year. And what it revealed is not the story of a freak accident on an unforgiving mountain. It is the story of a sequence. A long, documented, traceable sequence of decisions made by someone with the skill and knowledge to make different ones. This is the case of Kerstin Gurtner. Kerstin Gurtner grew up in Salzburg, a city where the Alps are not a destination but a backdrop, not something you travel to but something that is simply always there, framing the edge of the sky every morning. That kind of proximity to the mountains either becomes background noise or it becomes part of how you see yourself. For Kerstin, it became part of who she was. She was not reckless. She was not chasing records or pushing technical limits. She was the kind of person who finds something grounding in altitude, the quiet, the physical effort, the particular way a winter landscape looks when you are standing inside it rather than looking at it from below. Her social media reflected that without performance. Short captions, real photos, the kind of posts that don't ask for anything. She had been with Plamberger for some time before January 2025. He was in his mid-30s, experienced and serious about the mountains in a way that went beyond recreational enthusiasm. He had completed demanding alpine routes. He was comfortable in technical terrain. He understood the mechanics of high-altitude winter climbing, the margins, the timing, the consequences of getting either wrong. From the outside, the relationship looked natural. Two people who shared a love for the outdoors, a couple who climbed together, and that is true as far as it goes. But the distance between their experience levels was real and significant. When you climb with someone who knows the mountain and you do not, something happens without anyone saying it out loud. The decisions stop being mutual. The route choice, the gear check, the assessment of conditions, the judgment about when to go and when to stop, all of that migrates to the more experienced person, not through force or control, but through the simple logic of expertise. You follow because you trust the person who knows more. Kerstin followed. She trusted him. That trust, prosecutors would later argue in court, was never properly earned and never properly honored. On January 18, 2025, they set out to climb Grossglockner, Austria's highest peak at 3,798 meters, via the Stuttelgrat, a long and technically demanding southwest ridge route. In summer, with dry rock and good conditions, it is a serious outing. In winter, on ice and with alpine weather systems capable of shifting inside an hour, it is a route that demands everything go right from the beginning. Not everything went right. The first detail: they started approximately 2 hours later than the recommended window for a winter ascent of that route. This is not a scheduling inconvenience. In winter alpinism, timing is not just a preference, it is a safety mechanism. A 2-hour delay at the bottom of a long route means 2 hours less daylight on the technical upper sections. It means arriving at the exposed summit ridge in darkness. It means shrinking every margin the mountain was already not going to give you easily. That decision happened before they touched the approach trail. The second detail: Kerstin's boots. Court testimony and investigative reports later noted that she was not in rigid double plastic-lined mountaineering boots, the standard for front pointing on steep, icy, high-altitude terrain. She was in softer boots, the kind appropriate for a ski day or a comfortable winter hike, not the kind designed for what the Grossglockner's upper ridge would ask of her. Plamberger planned this tour. He knew the route. He understood what the terrain required. He was experienced enough to look at her footwear and understand the gap between what she was wearing and what the mountain would demand. He said nothing, and they went anyway. Let that sit for a moment, not as cruelty, not necessarily as calculation, but as the kind of negligence that comes from overconfidence, from a person who has done difficult things before and stopped measuring the difference between what he can handle and what his partner can. There is a particular quality to a serious alpine route in the hours before it turns dangerous. It looks manageable. The lower sections give way steadily, altitude accumulates, the air gets cleaner and the views get wider. You feel the effort in your legs, but the summit feels close, reachable, real. And then the upper mountain shows you what it actually demands. By the early evening of January 18th, Kerstin and Plamberger had reached the upper ridge of Grossglockner. The route was narrowing, the terrain steepening, and the sky above them had already shifted from dusk into the kind of alpine darkness that has no city glow underneath it. Wind had picked up along the exposed ridge. Temperatures were holding near -8 degrees Celsius, and with the wind chill on that open face, the felt temperature had pushed considerably lower. Their headlamps were visible from the valley. That matters more than it sounds. Mountain rescue teams are trained to read lights on a ridge at night the way doctors read vital signs. The position of those lights, the direction of movement, the pace. When lights stop moving or when they are still high on a route far past the hour when they should have descended, people on the ground start making calls. Someone made a call. At approximately 10:50 p.m., a rescue helicopter reached the area of their position on the upper ridge. A helicopter, not a coincidence, not a patrol. A rescue aircraft that was there because someone below had looked at those lights and concluded that the two people up on that mountain needed help. Plamberger did not signal it. He did not use an emergency whistle, did not wave, did not activate any device to direct the aircraft to their precise location. He later told investigators that he believed at that moment that they were both still capable of continuing, that the situation was manageable, that they were going to make the summit. Think about what that means. It is nearly 11 o'clock at night. They have been on the mountain for approximately 15 to 16 hours. The temperature with wind chill is somewhere near -20. Kerstin is in soft boots on icy terrain at over 3,700 meters. A rescue helicopter, which does not appear by coincidence, has just passed close enough to see. And he decided they were fine. That doesn't make sense. An experienced mountaineer does not need to guess what a helicopter at that location and that hour means. It means the people on the ground have already made the assessment that he was refusing to make for himself. It means help was within range, within sight, within 30 seconds of a signal. He let it pass. The next documented point on the timeline is 1:35 in the morning. That is when Plamberger placed his first call to Austrian Alpine Police. 2 hours and 45 minutes after the helicopter had already been and gone. 2 hours and 45 minutes in which Kerstin, at over 3,700 meters, in sub-zero temperatures, in soft boots on open terrain, continued to lose core body heat. But the call itself is not the end of this moment. After making it, after finally reaching for the phone and placing the call, he set the phone to silent. The Alpine Police called back. They called back multiple times. He did not answer. And that's where it breaks. You make an emergency call at 1:35 in the morning from the upper ridge of Austria's highest mountain. The emergency services call back to coordinate, to get your precise position, to understand the condition of the person with you, to dispatch help in the right direction. And you silence the phone. The window of coordinated rescue, narrow, specific, dependent on real-time communication, collapses into silence because the one person who could open it chose not to. Later, the digital record of that night would be assembled piece by piece. Phone logs, GPS altitude data from their sports watches, time-stamped photographs, webcam footage from the mountain. Prosecutors would spend 11 months building a timeline from these sources. And what that timeline would ultimately show is a sequence so documented, so specific, and so hard to explain as accident that it would carry a criminal case all the way to a verdict. Around 2:00 in the morning on January 19th, at a point approximately 50 meters below the summit cross of Grossglockner, Thomas Plamberger made his final decision on that ridge. He left. Kerstin was still there. She was exhausted, not tired in the way that a hard day makes you tired, but the kind of exhaustion that closes in on a person when the body has been fighting cold for hours and is beginning to lose. She was hypothermic. Her cognition, according to medical understanding of advanced cold exposure, would have been compromised, not necessarily visibly, not in a dramatic way, but in the specific, insidious way where a person can no longer accurately assess how badly they are doing. She was not wrapped in the emergency blankets they had carried up the mountain. She was not placed in any configuration that would reduce her exposure to the wind on that open face. She was not given any structural protection against the cold that was already inside her. She was left where she was. He later said it was her idea, that she told him to go, that she urged him to descend alone and bring help, that she gave him permission. That is his account. But prosecutors raised the question that anyone with medical knowledge of hypothermia would raise. At what point does a person in that condition retain the capacity to make an informed decision about their own life? If her cognition was already compromised by hours of cold exposure, if her judgment was already narrowing, if she was already past the threshold where the brain is working the way it needs to work, then what does consent mean in that moment? What does it mean when the person who holds more experience, more authority, and more physical reserve says she told me to go? That question would not be cleanly answered in court, but the evidence did answer something else. A webcam captured the upper ridge at approximately 2:30 a.m. one light descending, steady, moving toward lower ground, and a second light stationary, not descending slowly, not keeping pace from a distance, stationary and dimming. One person was moving down the mountain. The other was not. The investigation that followed was one of the most meticulous forensic reconstructions in recent Austrian alpine history. Prosecutors spent the better part of 11 months assembling data from every source available: phone records with timestamps and call logs, GPS altitude tracking from their sports watches, photographs taken during the climb, and the webcam footage that became one of the most striking pieces of evidence in the case. They commissioned an independent expert review from alpine professionals, people who understood the technical demands of this specific route in winter conditions and could evaluate each decision against recognized mountaineering standards. What that review produced was not a vague assessment of poor judgment. It was a list, 9 specific failures, 9 documented points at which the prosecution argued that an experienced mountaineer, a man who knew this terrain, who had planned this tour, who understood the conditions, made a choice that fell below basic standards and contributed directly to Kerstin Gurtner's death. A late departure of approximately 2 hours beyond the safe window for the route. Choosing a technically demanding winter line for a partner significantly below the required experience level. Allowing inappropriate footwear without intervention. Failing to initiate a turnaround when conditions and pace made the outcome foreseeable. Declining to signal or accept the helicopter rescue that passed their position. Delaying the emergency call by several hours after the situation had become critical. placing the phone on silent after making that call, thereby blocking the coordinated rescue window, leaving his partner inadequately protected in conditions that medical evidence indicated were already fatal without intervention, descending alone rather than remaining on the ridge to manage a direct rescue response. 9 moments, each one a point where a different choice was available, each one a point where his experience gave him the information to choose differently. None of them were chosen differently. Then something else surfaced during the investigation, something that was harder to explain away. In an earlier incident on a separate climb with a different woman, Plamberger had left that partner behind during a difficult stretch of the route. She had been struggling. Tension had developed between them. He left. She survived. She later testified. The defense argued strongly that this prior incident was irrelevant to the Kerstin Gurtner case. That one difficult moment on one previous hike could not be used to define a pattern and should not influence a verdict in a separate case on a separate mountain. Prosecutors saw it differently, not as proof of intent, but as a pattern of behavior under pressure. A pattern in which, when conditions become difficult and a partner becomes a burden, the response is the same. He leaves. What distinguished the first incident from the second was not the decision but the consequence. The first partner survived by luck or strength or both. The second did not. Kerstin was 33 years old when her margin ran out on that ridge. On February 19, 2026, the Innsbruck Regional Court delivered its verdict. Thomas Plamberger, guilty of gross negligent manslaughter. The judge did not describe him as someone who climbed that mountain wanting Kerstin dead. The language was precise and careful, the way legal language tends to be when it is trying to accurately hold something complex. What the judge said was this, that Plamberger had, by virtue of his experience and his role in planning and leading the tour, occupied a position of effective leadership responsibility on that climb. That leadership is not simply an identity or a title. It is an obligation. It carries specific duties toward a less experienced partner. And he had failed in those duties at 9 documented points. The sentence, 5 months in prison, fully suspended. He would not serve a day in jail, a fine of approximately €9,600. He walked out of the courtroom that afternoon. The reaction was not simple, and it should not be flattened into something simple. Among climbing communities, among women's groups, among many people who had followed the case closely, the response to the sentence was a specific kind of anger, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, quiet kind that comes when the math of justice feels wrong. A woman was dead. 9 failures had been documented, enumerated, and proven in a court of law. The person responsible for those failures received a suspended sentence and a fine. No prison. A fine that, in the context of what it was supposed to account for, felt small in a way that words don't fully capture. Others in the alpine and legal community made a different argument, that criminally convicting a recreational climber for decisions made on a mountain is rare in Austrian law, that the legal threshold for proving criminal negligence in an extreme sport context is genuinely high, that the verdict itself, the conviction, the finding that an experienced climber can be held criminally liable for the death of a less experienced partner was more significant as a precedent than the sentence suggested, that the law had moved, even if not as far as many people felt it should have. Both of those positions are honest responses to an honest problem. And then there was Kerstin's mother. Kerstin Gurtner sat in the gallery of that courtroom. She heard the testimony. She heard the 9 failures named and numbered. She heard the verdict, and in her public statements afterward she said she did not entirely blame Thomas. That is not a simple sentence to carry. It does not fit the shape that these stories are supposed to take, the grieving family in unified condemnation, the clear line between victim and villain, the closure that comes when everyone agrees on what happened and what it means. What Kerstin Gurtner expressed is something harder than that. Something more human. Because Thomas was not a stranger to her daughter. He was the person Kerstin loved. He was the person she had trusted with her safety on that mountain. And even after everything, after the 9 failures, after the verdict, after the sentence, grief does not always complete its journey to anger. That is not weakness. That is how loss actually works when the person responsible for it was also, at some point, someone you loved. But what is not complicated, what no amount of nuance or grief or legal complexity can soften is this. Kerstin Gurtner died 50 meters from the summit of the mountain she went there to climb. She died in wind and cold and darkness, after hours of deterioration, after every margin had been closed by a sequence of decisions that began before the first step on the approach trail and ended with a single light descending a ridge and another light staying behind. The boots were wrong. The start was too late. The route exceeded her experience level. A helicopter passed and went unanswered. An emergency call was delayed by hours. A phone was silenced when rescue tried to respond. Emergency blankets were carried up the mountain and never deployed. And when the critical moment arrived, when she was hypothermic and disoriented in conditions that would kill her if no one intervened, she was left alone in the cold by the person who was supposed to be her safety margin. Not by a stranger, not by the mountain, by her partner. There is a particular weight in that word when you apply it here, partner. It implies mutuality. It implies that two people are moving through something together, that their safety is a shared project, that if one of them reaches a limit, the other one stops too. It implies that experience flows toward the less experienced person rather than away from them, that the person who knows more uses that knowledge to protect the person who knows less. That is what a partner does on a mountain. That is not what happened on January 18th. Every one of those 9 failures had a corresponding moment where a different choice was there to be made. A turnaround at dusk when the pace was already telling the story. A signal to the helicopter that was already looking for them. A phone call placed hours earlier when the outcome was still reversible. A phone left on when rescue tried to call back. A blanket deployed. A decision to stay beside her and coordinate a rescue from the ridge rather than leave her there in the dark and walk down. Any one of those moments, any single one, all 9 of them went the same way. The case of Kerstin Gurtner will be referenced in alpine law discussions for years. It will appear in conversations about duty of care, about what it means to bring a less experienced person into serious terrain, about where recreational risk ends and criminal negligence begins. It will carry real legal weight, but before it is a legal precedent, it is something simpler. It is the story of a woman who loved the mountains, who trusted the person beside her to keep her safe, and who died because that trust was never equal to the confidence it was built on. She carried her trust all the way to 3,750 meters. He set it down in the snow and kept going. She was found the next morning, 50 meters from the summit, that close. If this case stayed with you, subscribe. These are the stories that deserve to be told with the weight they carry. The next one is already coming.